September 1st, 1939. The world watches in horror as German forces surge across the Polish border, their tanks rolling forward like an unstoppable tide. Within 48 hours, both Britain and France make their stand, declaring war on Germany. The Wehrmacht is now racing toward Warsaw, and here's what makes this absolutely mind-blowing. German military commanders are sweating bullets because they know something terrifying. Their western border, almost completely unguarded. If the French decided to march into Germany right now, there would be practically nothing stopping them. The German generals are watching, waiting, expecting a massive counterattack that should come at any moment. But then something bizarre happens, something that defies all military logic. The Allies just sit there, they watch, they wait, they do almost nothing. This period gets a name that sounds almost ridiculous given the stakes: the Phoney War. So here's the question that haunts military historians to this day. Why on earth didn't the most powerful military alliance in the world attack Germany when they had the perfect opportunity? Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I need you to do something. If you love learning about the pivotal moments that shaped our world, if you're fascinated by the decisions that changed history forever, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because we're going to explore the untold stories, the moments that textbooks skip over, the decisions that seemed crazy but made perfect sense at the time. We dig into the details that matter, the human stories behind the headlines. So subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, the story we're about to unfold will change how you see World War II forever. And hey, drop a comment below telling us what you think about this. Did the Allies make the right choice? Or was this the biggest strategic blunder in military history? Now let's get back to September 1939. While German infantry units, cavalry squadrons, and armored divisions are carving deep paths into Polish territory, Britain and France send Hitler a clear ultimatum: pull your troops back or face the consequences of war. Berlin doesn't even bother responding. So on September 3rd, London and Paris officially declare war, and what started as a German invasion of Poland has now exploded into the Second World War. But here's what makes this moment so fascinating. Hitler is genuinely shocked. He never actually believed that Britain and France would go to war over Poland. And now he's got a serious problem. The overwhelming majority of his military forces are committed to the Polish campaign, which means Germany's western frontier is sitting there, exposed and vulnerable. Let me paint you a picture of what happened in those crucial moments. There's this interpreter named Paul Schmidt, and he's the one who has to translate Britain's declaration of war to Hitler. He later describes the scene, and it's chilling. After Schmidt finishes delivering the message, the room falls into this heavy, suffocating silence. Hitler just sits there, completely frozen, staring straight ahead like he's turned to stone. The moments stretch out, feeling like an eternity. Then Hitler slowly turns to Ribbentrop, who's standing by the window looking equally paralyzed, and Hitler asks this simple question that carries so much weight. What now? Then Goering, one of Hitler's top commanders, turns to Schmidt and says something that sends shivers down everyone's spine. If we lose this war, may heaven have mercy on us. Now Hitler eventually pulls himself together and regains his confidence, but the Nazi leadership has every reason to be terrified in this moment. Think about the math here. When you combine the British and French empires, they have more troops than Germany. They have more aircraft. They have more warships. They have larger reserves of manpower. They control more natural resources. Their industrial base is bigger. On paper, this should be a straightforward victory for the Allies. And here's the kicker. Germany only has 11 divisions guarding its entire western border. 11. These divisions are positioned behind something called the West Wall, which the English-speaking world knows as the Siegfried Line. But here's the thing. This defensive line isn't even finished yet. Meanwhile, all of Germany's armored units and most of their air force are tied up in Poland, hundreds of miles to the east. Now let's look at what France has at their disposal. The French army has started mobilizing 4.5 million men. They have more than 2,000 tanks ready to go. They have 10,000 artillery pieces. Even without the British Expeditionary Force, which is already starting to arrive within days, French forces massively outnumber their German enemies along the Franco-German border. The military imbalance is staggering. There's this German general named Siegfried Westphal, and he makes a calculation that should terrify the German high command. He estimates that if France launches a full-scale offensive right now, German forces in the West could hold out for maybe 2 weeks. 2 weeks. That's it. This warning must be rattling around in German minds when something unexpected happens on September 7, 1939. French forces actually do cross the border in what history barely remembers as the Sarre Offensive. Here's the background. France made an alliance with Poland, and as part of that agreement, Paris promised to launch an attack in the West within 2 weeks of mobilization. Given how fast the German army is advancing through Poland, French Commander-in-Chief General Maurice Gamelin decides to start the operation even earlier than planned. Units from the 3rd and 4th French armies begin moving into German territory. They capture the heavily mined Warned Forest. They take several villages in those first few days. But overall, the French advance barely penetrates more than 8 kilometers along a 25-kilometer front. The fighting is surprisingly light, as one French soldier reports in his account. He describes how they haven't suffered many casualties so far. Most of their losses come from mines planted in German territory. He gives these examples that are both tragic and almost darkly comical. A soldier picks up a German officer's cap, and a mine explodes. Someone reaches for an apple hanging from a tree, and a mine explodes. A dead rabbit lies on the ground. Someone drags it, and another mine explodes. The most dangerous mines have delayed fuses that make them even more unpredictable. These deadly devices are buried throughout the villages they occupy. But then something strange happens. French forces come to a halt just short of the West Wall, and it's not because the Germans stopped them. It's because the High Command orders them to stop. For the next month, there are occasional potshots and small skirmishes, but nothing major. Gamelin views this limited offensive as having fulfilled France's pledge to Poland, and he's already convinced that Poland is lost anyway. When October arrives, French intelligence reports that the Germans are transferring divisions to the west, so the French make the decision to withdraw back to the Maginot Line by mid-October. This short-lived Sarre Offensive becomes the only significant ground operation of what people will eventually call the Phoney War. In French, they call it the Drôle de Guerre. In German, it's Sitzkrieg, which basically means sitting war. The offensive costs France about 1,500 casualties and Germany about 500. Then everything just stops. After the war ends, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admits something remarkable. He says that Allied inaction caught many Germans completely by surprise. They were astonished to find only minor skirmishes happening between the Siegfried and the Maginot Lines. They couldn't understand why France didn't seize this unique opportunity. This convinced them that the Western powers didn't actually want war against Germany. So now we come to the central mystery. Why don't the British and French invade Germany when its western border is practically undefended? The answer is more complex than you might think, and it reveals something fascinating about military strategy, political reality, and human psychology. One major reason the Allies don't act aggressively is that their entire war strategy focuses on fighting a long war of attrition rather than a fast-moving, decisive campaign in the field. British and French military planners know that over the long term, they have significant advantages over Germany, just like they did in the First World War. They believe they need time to fully mobilize their forces and their industrial capacity to be ready for a conflict they expect will take at least 5 years to win. France particularly wants time to purchase more aircraft from the United States to strengthen its weak air force. Britain needs time to build up a full-strength army capable of fighting alongside the French. By the end of September, there are only 150,000 British troops in France, which is far too few to share the burden effectively. The Allies also implement a naval blockade of Germany starting on September 4th. This is part of their plan for a prolonged conflict, but they make a critical miscalculation. They greatly underestimate the impact that Soviet raw materials will have on Germany's war effort. Allied planners have this vision that their militaries and economies will be ready to launch a carefully planned offensive by 1941 or 1942. They've basically accepted that Poland will be occupied by Germany, and they're planning to restore Polish independence after their eventual victory. There's this British diplomat named Alexander Cadogan, who puts the case very bluntly in mid-September 1939, and his words turn out to be eerily prophetic. He says, "We must lose the war for 4 years before we win a decisive battle." A crucial part of this strategic thinking is their belief in the superiority of defensive warfare. This is another major lesson they've taken from the First World War. The logic goes like this. If Germany attacks first, the French will be able to fight from the advantageous position of their Maginot Line, which consists of extensive and powerful fortifications running along the border. A defensive strategy, Paris hopes, will save precious French lives. And this concern about casualties isn't abstract or theoretical. France suffered worse casualties than Britain or Germany in the First World War. The country's low birth rate means it has far fewer men of military age than Germany or Britain. In fact, France's population in 1939 is roughly the same as it was back in 1914. This demographic reality gives French military planners even more reason to wait until the British have raised a large enough army to help carry more of the combat burden. French leaders also desperately want to avoid having France become the main battlefield again, as it had been during the First World War. This concern makes Belgium absolutely critical to Allied strategy. The plan is to meet an eventual German attack in Belgium rather than on French soil. But here's the problem. The Belgians refuse to cooperate with any war planning because of their strict neutrality policy. This creates a key weakness in Allied strategy because France would be dangerously exposed if the Germans move through Belgium like they did in 1914. The Franco-Belgian border isn't covered by the Maginot Line either, partly because it would have been too expensive to extend the fortifications that far, and partly because the water table in that region is too shallow to build the kind of deep fortifications the Maginot Line requires. Belgium's stubborn adherence to strict neutrality means that France is more vulnerable, and it makes even less sense for the French to venture an offensive into Germany. Many Allied leaders, including General Gamelin himself, are deeply frustrated by Belgium's position. Gamelin later writes scathing words about the Belgians, calling them unthinking, short-sighted mediocrities who share much of the blame for Poland's destruction. He argues that they've considerably handicapped Franco-British action when they could have helped in numerous ways. Belgium must bear heavy responsibility, he writes, and she will pay for it by serving as the battlefield for the great powers. Instead of attacking Germany directly, French planners become drawn to alternative strategies that might take the war to other theaters. There's serious talk, for example, about a plan to bomb Soviet oil facilities at Baku and stop oil shipments on the Caspian and Black Seas. The theory is that depriving the German army of oil would bring about strategic success without the bloody cost of ground combat. Allied leaders also discuss plans to drop mines into the Rhine River to disrupt German shipping. There are discussions about potential interventions in the Balkans or Norway. Winston Churchill, who's serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, even suggests a naval incursion into the Baltic Sea. This would likely result in heavy losses to the Royal Navy, but at this point in the war, the full lethality of air power against warships isn't yet clearly understood. But all of these bold moves in the West would require significant political capital, and that's something France is desperately short on. French politics in this period are bitterly divided. There's intense conflict between the far right and far left. There are deep divisions between those committed to the war effort and those who aren't. Bitter personal rivalries poison the atmosphere. There are even some French politicians and military figures who say France shouldn't take risks at the front because Britain might abandon them and make a separate peace with Germany. The military leadership situation is equally problematic. Allied command structures are overly complicated and inefficient. General Gamelin is not a decisive commander. Charles de Gaulle, who will later become one of France's greatest leaders, compares Gamelin to a scientist calmly experimenting in a laboratory, completely detached from the urgent realities of war. During high-level meetings in mid-September, the Allies confirmed their choice for a long-term attritional strategy based on defensive warfare. This makes more sense in their view, given how they're thinking about the type of fighting they expect to face in 1941 or 42. The Maginot Line sits at the absolute heart of French military doctrine. Built between 1929 and 1937, this system of deep, well-armed and strategically positioned fortifications stretches 145 kilometers along the Franco-German border. The larger forts contain multiple batteries of guns hidden in rotating turrets. They have fully functional facilities for garrison life, including electric generators and narrow-gauge railway systems for supply and ammunition transport. It represents state-of-the-art military engineering. The Maginot Line costs the French state so much money that they have to cut funding from other parts of the military budget to build it. The line fits perfectly with French army doctrine, which is based on what they see as their winning formula from the First World War, relying on massive use of artillery in a long war of attrition where the defender enjoys tactical and operational advantages. Given that the French and British empires with access to American production capacity and financial resources are economically stronger than Germany, this approach makes sense to Allied leaders who are fearful of the terrible cost of an all-out offensive. General Henri Pétain summarizes France's approach to warfare with a memorable phrase. France's strategy was to be lavish with steel, stingy with blood. The French army is more modern than it was in 1918. They have more tanks and better tanks too. They've achieved partial motorization of their forces. They have fewer cavalry units. They possess modern air power. But their fundamental doctrine is still rooted in 1918 thinking. The tanks, which are arguably no worse than their German counterparts and of which the Allies actually have more than the Germans, are designed to support the infantry and advance under the protective cover of artillery fire. The French Air Force is also built primarily to deny French airspace to the Germans, rather than to carry out an offensive air war. The Armée de l'Air only has about 100 bombers at the start of the war. It's a centralized, controlled, and limited approach to fighting a war of materiel that simply doesn't lend itself to the unique dilemma of September 1939, when striking at Germany would mean seizing the initiative with limited resources. This kind of thinking has framed French military thought for years. In 1935, War Minister General Louis Morin reveals this mindset when he asks, "Why, having built our fortifications of the Maginot Line, would we leave them to embark on who knows what adventure?" Another factor in Allied calculations is that their intelligence analysts mistakenly assess that Germany, which has been rearming for longer than the Allies have, has already reached its economic peak for war mobilization and is more ready for war than they are. This incorrect assessment reinforces their decision to wait. French thinking about the primacy of defensive warfare and the value of their own fortifications means they won't even consider turning that doctrine upside down in 1939. This is especially true when Germany has its own defensive line that the French would have to overcome: the West Wall. The Siegfried Line is actually unfinished and far weaker than the French imagine, but their faith in the power of the Maginot Line increases their perception of how dangerous it would be to attack the West Wall. Even the better-equipped and motorized British Expeditionary Force adopts a defensive stance. When British units begin arriving in France during September 1939, they immediately start building their own line of bunkers and pillboxes. This becomes known as the Gort Line, named after BEF commander Lord Gort. So Allied strategy, military doctrine, and political realities all combine to explain why they failed to invade Germany in the fall of 1939. After Poland is defeated by German and Soviet forces in October, the Phoney War in the West remains stuck in this strange limbo. Both sides try to take advantage of the quiet period by preparing for the spring campaign they know is coming. Fighting remains limited to artillery exchanges and occasional skirmishes. While these engagements are rare, they're absolutely terrifying for the soldiers who experience them. One soldier describes an incident that captures this terror perfectly. While he and his comrades are cutting trees in a forest near the front line, German artillery starts bombarding them. He doesn't know how he survived. He's convinced that divine intervention saved his life. One of his friends, lying just 1.5 meters away from him, is cut in two by shrapnel and dies without making a sound. Another soldier, even closer, has his ribs broken and his belly opened by flying metal fragments. 6 days after this horrific event, as this soldier writes a letter home, he's still crying when he thinks about the horrible carnage and the horrifying screams of dying men. At various points along the Rhine River, French and German soldiers simply observe each other's comings and goings. This includes German propaganda broadcasts transmitted via loudspeakers that try to create anti-British feelings among French troops. On the British home front, German fortifications become the subject of a popular morale-boosting song called "We're Going to Hang Out the Washing on the Siegfried Line." Contrary to pre-war expectations, neither side launches a mass strategic bombing campaign. Both the British and the French fear that bombing cities will result in catastrophic death and destruction. The French especially lack adequate air defenses and radar systems. Pre-war British estimates had predicted that the Luftwaffe could drop 3,500 tons of bombs on London on the very first day of war. They calculated that 600,000 British civilians might be killed in the first 6 months, based on the military theory that the bomber will always get through. These predictions of a devastating knockout blow do not materialize because neither side has enough heavy bombers or a feasible operational plan for strategic bombing. The Germans don't plan a strategic bombing campaign at this stage of the war. The Allies fear devastating retaliation if they start one. So both sides limit their air activity mostly to dropping propaganda pamphlets, conducting reconnaissance flights, and executing limited bombing raids against specific military or naval targets located away from major population centers. This is a far cry from the devastating bombing of Polish cities that the Luftwaffe has just carried out. The French worked to improve their army's organization and equipment during these quiet months. But the lack of action combined with a long, brutal winter takes a serious toll on morale and discipline. The months of inactivity during an especially harsh winter gradually eat away at French readiness for combat operations. Even though French society generally accepts the reasons for going to war, the conditions on the ground create serious problems. Morale and discipline both suffer. Alcohol abuse becomes an issue. Water quality problems emerge. Disease spreads through the ranks. Housing is poor. Food quality deteriorates. The statistics are shocking. Suicides account for 3.8% of French military deaths during this period. Many soldiers also resent wealthier or privileged French citizens who manage to avoid military service. Some troops suspect that Britain has dragged France into a war that doesn't serve French interests. While many French troops spend the winter in uncomfortable barracks or makeshift bunkers, conditions inside the Maginot Line are often quite good. Still, the men find that spending most of their time underground steadily saps their morale. One soldier writes in December about his experience, "I can assure you that I have had enough of this underground life. I have been here since August 23rd, and it is more than enough because, as you know, there is no distraction, and we are only allowed 1 hour to breathe outside." The Phoney War also creates a strange disconnect between the home front and the troops serving at the border. The famous French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, serving as a soldier, exchanges letters with his partner Simone de Beauvoir, whom he affectionately nicknames Castor. His words capture the surreal quality of this period. A ghost war, a Kafkaesque war. I cannot feel it, it is fleeing me. Military dispatches say nothing of our losses. Wounded men are nowhere to be seen. The Germans are not on our soil, no bombardment of the rear. Castor is at war, not me. I imagine that this feeling is common to many. When I left Castor on September 2nd, I was ready for more and for better than this quiet mediocrity. Now I am infected, rotten. Some British officers develop a dim view of their French allies and begin to suspect that the French army might prove unreliable when serious fighting begins. General Alan Brooke reacts to watching a French military march past in November with barely concealed disgust. His description is damning. Men unshaven, horses ungroomed, clothes and saddlery that did not fit, vehicles dirty, and complete lack of pride in themselves and their units. What shook me the most, however, was the look in the men's faces. Disgruntled and insubordinate looks. Although ordered to give the eyes left, hardly a man bothered to do so. Behind the front lines, both the Germans and the Allies are busy planning for major operations that everyone knows must come in 1940. In November, the Allied command confirms something called the Dial-Breda Plan. This strategy involves British and French forces moving into Belgium and the Netherlands if Germany launches an attack against them. But here's the catch that makes this plan incredibly risky. It can't be prepared in advance. Why? Because the Dutch and Belgians absolutely refuse to work with the Allies. They're determined to maintain their neutrality at all costs. So if the Germans do invade, everything will have to be figured out on the spot, in the chaos of combat. It's military planning at its most desperate. Hitler initially wants to launch his Western offensive as early as November of 1939. He's eager to strike while he believes he has momentum, but numerous delays keep pushing back the timeline, and many of his own generals actively oppose the plan. They think it's too risky, too soon. Case Yellow, as the operation is codenamed, keeps getting postponed until the spring, and Hitler very nearly doesn't get the chance to launch his Western offensive at all. There's this German resistor named Georg Elser who plants a bomb in a Munich brewery, where Hitler is scheduled to give a speech. The bomb explodes, but Hitler has already left the building just minutes before. History pivots on these tiny moments. The Phoney War represents a neglected period of the Second World War, and it might not have remained so neglected if the Allies had actually struck decisively in September 1939. But their commitment to a strategy built around a long war, their deeply ingrained defensive doctrine, their genuine doubts about their own military capabilities, and their fundamental reluctance to take major risks means that everything remains very quiet on the Western Front. But all of this eerie quiet is about to shatter spectacularly in May of 1940. When you really think about the Phoney War, it's often completely overlooked in most coverage of the Second World War. Classic documentaries tend to skip right over it because it doesn't seem dramatic enough. There aren't massive battles to show. There aren't heroic charges or desperate last stands. But understanding this period is absolutely vital for making sense of what happens in 1940. And it certainly didn't feel undramatic or unimportant to the millions of people who lived through it, wondering every day if this strange quiet would suddenly explode into violence. The decisions made during these months reveal something profound about how nations think about war, about how military doctrine can blind leaders to opportunity, about how political division can paralyze action. The French and British commanders weren't stupid or cowardly. They were making calculations based on what they believed was rational military thinking. They looked at the First World War and drew conclusions that made sense to them. They saw the terrible cost of offensive warfare and decided that defense was wiser. They calculated that time was on their side, that their combined resources would eventually overwhelm Germany if they just waited long enough. But they were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Because while they sat behind their fortifications, while they waited and planned and prepared, the Germans were also preparing. German military theorists were developing new tactics that would combine tanks, aircraft, and infantry in ways that would shatter the static defensive warfare the Allies expected. The Blitzkrieg was coming, though the Allies couldn't see it yet. The soldiers on both sides during the Phoney War lived in this strange, suspended state. They were at war, but they weren't really fighting. They watched each other across no man's land. They listened to propaganda broadcasts. They dealt with mines and occasional artillery fire. They got cold, got sick, got bored, got depressed. The psychological toll of waiting for a battle that never quite comes can be worse than actual combat in some ways. At least in battle, you know what you're facing. During the Phoney War, soldiers just waited, wondering when the real war would finally begin. For the French soldiers stuck in the Maginot Line, life took on a surreal quality. These massive fortifications were technological marvels, underground cities designed for warfare. They had electric lights, ventilation systems, narrow-gauge railways to move supplies and ammunition. The larger installations had kitchens, dormitories, command centers, hospitals. Some soldiers spent months underground, emerging only briefly for fresh air. They could hear German forces on the other side of the fortifications, but they rarely saw them. They were warriors living in a concrete tomb, waiting for a battle that kept not happening. The home front in both France and Britain struggled to understand what was happening. They had prepared for immediate, devastating air raids that never came. They had steeled themselves for massive casualties that didn't materialize. The disconnect between the war people had imagined and the war that was actually happening created confusion and uncertainty. Some people began to wonder if maybe the war would just fade away, if maybe some diplomatic solution would be found. This was wishful thinking, of course, but it was understandable, given how strange the situation had become. German civilians were equally confused. They had been told they were at war with France and Britain, but nothing seemed to be happening. There were no reports of massive battles. Life continued with a strange kind of normality. Hitler's propaganda machine worked overtime trying to explain why the Western powers had declared war, but weren't actually fighting. The explanation they settled on was that Britain and France didn't really want to fight Germany, that they had been forced into war by Jewish conspiracies and international capitalism. It was nonsense, but it helped maintain morale on the German home front. Meanwhile, in Poland, the reality of war was anything but phony. Polish forces fought desperately against the German invasion from the west and the Soviet invasion from the east. Polish cities were bombed. Civilians were killed. The country was being torn apart, while the Western allies who had promised to help mostly just watched. This created a bitter sense of betrayal among Poles that would last for generations. They had been promised support, but that support never really came. The limited Sarre Offensive was too little, too late, too half-hearted to make any difference to Poland's fate. The strategic calculations that led to Allied inaction made sense from a certain perspective, but they ignored crucial realities. The Allies assumed they had time, but they didn't really understand how quickly modern mechanized warfare could move. They assumed that defensive fortifications would prove decisive, but they didn't anticipate how combined arms tactics would bypass those fortifications. They assumed Germany was already at peak military mobilization, but they were wrong about that too. They assumed their blockade would strangle the German economy, but Soviet supplies undermined that strategy. Every assumption the Allies made during the Phoney War would prove faulty when the real fighting began. The months they spent waiting, preparing, building confidence in their defensive positions would be shattered in weeks when the German offensive finally came. The Maginot Line that was supposed to be impregnable would be bypassed. The carefully prepared defensive positions would be outflanked. The doctrine that prioritized artillery and static defense would prove helpless against fast-moving armored columns supported by tactical air power. Looking back, it's easy to see the Phoney War as a massive, missed opportunity for the Allies. If they had attacked in September 1939 when Germany's western border was virtually undefended, they might have shortened the war by years. They might have saved millions of lives. They might have prevented the Holocaust. But they didn't know that at the time. They were making decisions based on incomplete information, based on lessons they thought they had learned from the previous war, based on political and military realities that constrained their options. So now we come to the end of this remarkable story, and I want you to think about something. History isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding why people made the choices they made, even when those choices seem incomprehensible to us now. The Phoney War teaches us that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one firing at you. Sometimes it's your own assumptions, your own doctrines, your own unwillingness to see that the world has changed. If you've made it this far, you clearly love diving deep into history's most fascinating moments. You want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. You want the full story, not just the highlights. That's exactly what we do on this channel. We take the overlooked moments, the forgotten periods, the decisions that shaped everything, and we explore them fully. So if you haven't already, subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell, because we've got so many more stories to tell, so many more mysteries to unravel, and I want you here for every single one. Like this video if you found it valuable. Share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And tell me in the comments, knowing what you know now, what would you have done if you were leading Britain or France in September 1939? Would you have attacked, or would you have waited? I genuinely want to know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.